Like Gordon said, my name is Colton. If I have not met you, I would like to meet you. We do youth group on Tuesday nights with 7th through 12th grade, and we've been going over this book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes. If you're not familiar with the book, or if you are, it's kind of a downer. If you read it looking for inspiration, you're probably going to walk away, unless you're like really thinking about it, you're like, ooh, that doesn't really inspire me. I thought I was reading the Bible to feel good this morning, and instead now I feel like everything is meaningless. So the tagline I put on here is that life without God, meaningless. That is basically the summary of the book. And this book is an interesting book. It's one of the books of wisdom in the Bible. So you think Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon. And these books are read a little bit differently. You don't read them the same way that you might read Genesis or one of the letters in the New Testament. Instead, you read it for the principles and the lessons that it gives that apply to life in a general sense. And so this morning, we're going to be looking at this book, but I think to get to this book, we also need to understand a little bit more about who wrote it. So Ecclesiastes is believed to have been written by Solomon, although it's not said expressly in the book. It doesn't say, I, Solomon, wrote this. Instead, it says that it's written by a son of David who is king over Israel in Jerusalem, and that is someone that was known for their wisdom. And all of those three things point directly to Solomon. And so traditionally, it is believed that Solomon wrote this book. Some people disagree, and that's fine, but we do know, and we do know for sure that this is the Word of God. This is Scripture. And whether or not he's the one that took the pen to the page or somebody else wrote it through his perspective, we know that these are the words of God, and we take them as such. So to get to this point, we're going to start actually in the book of 1 Kings, and we're going to read a little bit about Solomon. So if you have your Bible, if you would turn to 1 Kings chapter 3, and we're going to read a handful of verses, then we're going to jump to the middle of this book. So 1 Kings chapter 3, if you forgot a Bible, there's some in the back, or there's a handy app on your phone that I always use whenever I forget my Bible or leave it in the car. All right, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 3. It starts like this. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David, his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown your great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted, or multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people? It pleases the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and not asked for yourself for long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk with my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So Solomon is known for his wisdom. If you look up anything, that's what you'll see. He wrote the Proverbs, he wrote the Song of Solomon. But Solomon was a son of David, not his first son, but he was a son of David born to Bathsheba, the same Bathsheba that we read about with David's adultery. And Solomon is their second son. And when David was old and nearing the end of his life, another one of David's sons actually tried to take the throne. His name was Adonijah. And Adonijah was an older brother of Solomon, and he conspired with another priest as well as one of the generals in Solomon's army to take over the kingdom. And he did this without David knowing. He went behind David's back, and he gathered the people that he thought might support him, and he went and he declared himself king over Israel. He declared himself king, and then he threw basically his own banquet, his own welcoming party, which is not something you do. You don't throw yourself a party. But he did this because he wanted the kingdom. And on that day, Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan, who heard about this and who were not in support of this, they talked to each other and were like, wait, like, how can he do this? David said Solomon was to be king. And so Nathan tells Bathsheba, go to your husband and tell him what has happened. And so Bathsheba goes into her husband, who's at this point, the Bible says, he's so cold that blankets can't even keep him warm. Like, he is old, he's on his deathbed, and he's laying there, and Bathsheba tells him, hey, this is happening, and David's like listening. And then as she's speaking, Nathan arrives, and they had planned this so that Nathan would confirm the things that Bathsheba was telling him. And Nathan comes in, and he says, David, did you know that your son Adonijah is declared king? Like, did you know that this was happening? And he says, why didn't you tell us? If this was what you had planned, why didn't you tell us? And David, in this moment, he is surprised, although he's probably not shocked. This isn't the first one of his sons that has tried to take over the kingdom of Israel, but I'm sure he's disappointed in this moment. And so he, realizing that he had made a promise that Solomon would be king, that very day he made it happen. Like, he's really old. He probably is pretty frail. He's cold, it says. And on the very day that this issue is brought to him, he's like, no, Solomon will be king. And Solomon is anointed king that very day. So at this exact time, all the people with Adonijah who just declared himself king, they're having this banquet. And I love this when it says in the Bible that when they got out of the banquet, all of the noise from Solomon being declared king, like, it was a party. David, like, announced it. He was anointed. And the noise was so loud, it said that the earth shook. It's like if there was a party way over there or at Clovis Hills across the street, and it was so loud that we get out of church and we hear it. And you're like, oh, what's going on? So Adonijah asked someone, he's like, hey, what's happening? And they say, Solomon has been declared king. And Adonijah was afraid, as I would probably be if I just tried to take over a kingdom and then I was told my brother is actually king. And that loud noise, that rumbling that I'm feeling is him. And so Adonijah runs, he hides, David forgives him, or Solomon forgives him. And that day, as Solomon is declared king, he does a couple different things, but he's still kind of living under David. Like, he's young, he takes over, but David's still kind of like your go-to person. If you've ever taken over a job for someone, you're like, who you're going to go to for advice? The person that's done this job for 40 years. That's what I would do. And at the end of David's life, which wasn't shortly after, we read in 1 Kings, you don't have to turn there. It says, when David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth, meaning that he's going to die. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. And then shortly after that, David died. That was his final blessing to his son Solomon, who at this point with the passing of David is now like the guy. He doesn't have someone to turn to. He is in charge. And that's where we get to the verse we read a moment ago about Solomon walking and worshiping God. The verse starts with Solomon loved the Lord. And then it talks about how he asked God for wisdom. And for 10 chapters, we read about Solomon's rise. Lord gave him wisdom, gave him the ability to discern. And in his wisdom, you hear the story of two mothers who brought a baby to him. They said, oh, this baby is mine. No, this baby is mine. And they're arguing over it. And Solomon, in his wisdom, says, here's what we'll do. And I imagine that he had to hold back a little bit of a smile because he knew what was going to happen. He said, hey, we're just going to cut the baby in half. You can each take a half. And the real mother's like, no, like, she can have the baby because the real mother doesn't want her baby to die. And Solomon knew that this would happen. And so we see in this one little instance some of Solomon's wisdom. But his wisdom didn't end there. He also was revered throughout the entire kingdom, but also neighboring kingdoms. People would come from thousands of miles away to sit at his feet, to learn from him, to ask him questions. Famously, the king or the queen of Sheba came to him asking for wisdom. She asked him questions. She tried to ask him questions that he couldn't answer, but he did. And so God made him wiser than anyone before him or after him. And Solomon's also known for another couple of things. The first is his wealth. Solomon accumulated so much wealth. He is considered to be one of, if not the richest person in history. If he showed up today, he would be wealthier than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, like combined. It's not an exact number, but people estimate in the multiple of trillions of dollars. And that's crazy. I can't imagine having that much money. He also was very powerful. During his reign, he expanded the kingdom of Israel. He took it from where David had it, and he said, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here. And the Bible describes that he had basically the entire promised land under his thumb. Like, he had it. He got everything that God had promised to the Israelites. He also married Pharaoh's daughter, and he came with an alliance to Pharaoh, and he built trade. We think about great kingdoms, and we're like, yeah, they have big armies, which Solomon had, tons of horses, tons of chariots. He had a great army. He built stables everywhere, but he also built a trade, like empire. That's not really talked about that much, but he built places and ships where he could trade throughout the water. He built ways to trade throughout the land, and in all of this, Solomon basically governed wisely. If there was any problem that arose, he knew how to take care of it. He knew how to handle it. And I would like to think, as someone who really likes organization and systems, that if I were to visit Israel during this time, I could just ask some questions and be like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You did it this way? I didn't think about that. The way he governed was wise. He didn't make those mistakes that we see leaders in our time making. He made good decisions. He also is known, perhaps his greatest accomplishment is building the temple of the Lord, the first temple, something promised by David before him, but who David did not build. Solomon built this temple. He spent 7 years constructing it, and it was the first place other than a tent, the tabernacle, that God's presence came and dwelt among earth. And this was a very important thing. And you read about what the temple looked like, and to our standards, it might not seem big. It was probably similar in size to this room. But it was fancy. If you read, it was completely decked out in gold. It was extravagant. The Bible talks about how every single thing was carved and ornate, and gold was inlaid here. And it talks about the doors and the walls and things that we don't even consider. If I were to describe this room, I probably wouldn't say, oh yeah, that's the color of that wall, and the ceiling is kind of white. And no, it's not factors that we think about. But Solomon built this temple that was absolutely immaculate. And so for 10 chapters in the book of Kings, we read about Solomon's rise. And it's beautiful. And he does everything so well. And then we come to the end of Solomon's life, and we read another chapter. And so 10 chapters up and 1 chapter to fall. And so if you turn to 1 Kings chapter 11, we're going to read, let's see, I have it here. We're going to read about his fall. My bookmark fell out, so I'm not there yet either. All right, 1 Kings chapter 11. All right. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountains of East Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from them, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hands of your son. And however, I will not tear away the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So we see two contrasting ways that these passages start. At the beginning of Solomon's rise, we read, first, Solomon loved the Lord. And at the beginning of chapter 11, we read, now King Solomon loved many foreign women. And we see throughout his life that his affections changed. No longer did he worship and obey God as the first primary aspect of his life, the center of his life. Instead, it became his wives. And the Bible talks about these many wives that Solomon had not as a good thing. This was very clearly a bad thing. If you go back to Deuteronomy, we see rules for kings of Israel that were set up. And Deuteronomy in chapter 17, speaking of what a king must be, it says, only he must not acquire many horses for himself. Check one. Solomon got many horses. Or cause the people to return to Egypt. Ooh, that's where he got the horses. In order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Solomon lived a great life. By any means, he was very successful. And what's hard is that he knew better. More than anyone else, he knew better. In fact, he was the one that wrote this proverb. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your way acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Solomon wrote that, and yet he did not trust in the Lord. He trusted in his own understandings. And there is a temptation to that if you're as wise and as smart as he is. The more gifted you are, sometimes the harder it is to be humble. But Solomon knew better, and yet he failed. He disobeyed God. And so what does this have to do with Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes is a book that is written by Solomon, like I said, but it's written as kind of an epilogue or a memoir of his life. And if you're not familiar per se, think about Marvel movies. At the end of the credits, they'll have a little scene that's hints at what's coming next, or older movies might have credits that tell you what happened after the story finished. I love sports biopics, what tells about a team that overcame great odds, and at the end of the movie is them coming off a bus or a plane, and they're celebrating, and they're walking out, and it just pauses and some words show up. So they're cheering at whole crowds there. They walk up, it pauses, and it's Jimmy went to this college and became a professional. And then they keep walking, another one comes out, and they're and it pauses again, and you get some more information that tells you what happened. And it might throw in a little joke there, a little reference, oh, Billy finally learned how to tie his shoes. And if you watch the movie, you're yeah, Billy, that crazy guy. And so an epilogue or a memoir, it's kind of reflecting back on Solomon's life. And so as we read Ecclesiastes now, we're going to see that it directly references Solomon's life in a way that if you don't know his life, if you didn't watch the movie, that little bit at the end, you're I get that that's saying something, but I don't quite understand what they're talking about. And so if you would, turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. It comes right after the book of Proverbs, right after the Psalms. Okay. Move my notes. So before we start reading, I want to clarify a few key terms that appear over and over again in this book. The first one is, in my version, it says the word vanity. Yours, depending on your translation, might say the word meaningless. This comes from the Hebrew word hebel, which literally translates to more like vapor or smoke. And when it's used in this book, it points to like the fleeting nature of things. If you've ever tried to like catch smoke or contain vapor, you really can't. Like you can't get it. And so over and over again in this book, it is going to talk about vanity and meaningless. And it's going to declare a lot of things to be that way. And it feels a little down, but I promise we're going to get past the down. Like Solomon went 10 chapters up. We're going to go a few chapters down, and then we're going to come back up at the end to see where we actually find meaning. The second thing that comes is this idea of gain, this idea of acquiring something. Over and over in the book, it asks this question, what does man gain? Or what can be gained? And in our life, we like to gain things. I like to acquire things. And then it uses another term that is almost always following the word vanity, and it's striving after the wind, which feels like an exclamation point on that point. Like it's vapor that's striving after the wind. It's like it's going away. You can't, not only is it hard to catch initially, but it's going away. If you've ever put out a fire, like a campfire, and it's really windy, it's like it's gone. You stand over here because it's blowing that way, but even if you stood over there, you couldn't really capture any of it. And the last thing is this phrase, under the sun, or under heaven. And this phrase is what sets this book apart from other writings that might feel similar, other things that might feel hopeless. And the term under the sun is a phrase that denotes like a time and place. So under the sun is where we are right here, right now. It also has this implication of without God or apart from God. So when it says that something is under the sun, it's like this is what I'm seeing right where I am, and God's like not in this picture of my mind. And if you've ever gone through something hard, even if you know God exists, you believe God exists, in that moment where you're facing something truly tragic, you might not even be thinking about God. You're just focused on where you are in that place and time. You're like, how do I deal with this? And that's kind of what this phrase feels like. So we're going to pick up in chapter 2. And, okay, right here. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So it says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. So this chapter starts off with Solomon. He's essentially going to try to do as many things as he can to bring pleasure, to bring enjoyment to his life. So I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity or meaningless. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the days of their life. And then he continues, and he kind of brags about himself. He pats himself on the back, says, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil or work, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So this first passage that we're looking at this morning, it has all to do with pleasure, satisfaction. And he starts off by saying, yeah, I'm going to try things. Like, I'm going to do whatever I want. And he says that he became great. He was great. He knew it. If you were the king of a nation, if you had that much money, if you had that much power, if you were the smartest person around, like, you knew it. There's no way you would not know it. And so he documents all these things he did, these things he built, these things he acquired. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. Solomon got everything. And he says at the end that all was vanity or meaningless and a striving after the wind. It's like an exclamation point on the meaninglessness of it. And he says, and there's nothing to be gained. He didn't really gain anything from it under the sun. And so I want you to picture you were somewhat in Solomon's shoes. Imagine right now I just deposited $3 trillion into your bank account, and I gave you like 100,000 people. These are now your employees. They'll do whatever you tell them to do. And you have the entire Central California, from the mountains to the coast. It is all yours. What are you going to do with that? I would start making like a list. My mind would start racing like, I could do anything I wanted. Like, no one can tell me no. Like, it's mine. California can't stop me from doing whatever I want. I'm going to start making a list, and I'm going to think, okay, I have all this money. I have all this power. I'm going to do whatever I want. This is how Solomon was. He could do whatever he wanted. There was no one that could really tell him no. And so he did. He did whatever he wanted. I don't know if you guys know this. I don't think it's always been like this, but on Amazon, you have your saved for later. So it's like you put something in your cart, like, oh, I shouldn't quite buy that yet. So you hit save for later, and it goes down below, and it goes into a list. And at some point in time, I'm not sure when, Amazon capped that list at 500 items. And the only reason I know this is because I have 500 items in my saved for later. And I remember the first time I realized that they had like lowered it or whatever it was before, I don't know. I was so disappointed because I'm like, now I'm never going to know what was after that 500 item. Do I know what number 500 is? No, but I know if I move something to save for later now, whatever's at 500 disappears. And I'm like, oh, that's so disappointing. But if someone said, hey, I'll buy everything on your Amazon list, for the next couple of weeks, I would be ecstatic. There'd be things showing up my door. The Amazon driver would hate me. I would have so much joy over the next few weeks. And this is exactly what Solomon experienced. He went through life, experienced everything, and it was joyful, and it was great. But then at the end of it, he was like, oh, what do I really have? If I got everything on my Amazon list, wonderful. Okay, so if I got everything on my Amazon list, those few weeks would be great. But after I got everything, I'd be like, now what? I'd still kind of want more. During those few weeks, I'd probably add more things to my cart. And I was like, I don't need that. But I'm not satisfied with the 2 billion packages showing up on my door. And so Solomon accomplished everything on his list, and he realized at the end that it wasn't satisfying. He realized that it was meaningless. What did he really gain from it? Like, yeah, he had all these things, and those are great things. We definitely I don't want you to get the idea that any of these things are necessarily bad. Party. But these weren't bad things, but Solomon elevated them above God, and so he turned them into idols. And they became bad because of how much importance he put on them. And so if we continue reading in Ecclesiastes, starting at verse 12, here, we'll close that. He continues, so he just said that everything was meaningless, striving after the wind, all is vanity. And so he continues, says, so I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly or foolishness. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly. It's better to be wise than a fool, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them, that being death. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. For the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. So I want to do a quick exercise in your head. I want you to think, can you name your parents? like in your head, like, yeah, I know them. Can you name your grandparents? Maybe you got 3 out of 4. Maybe you know all 4 names. What about your great-grandparents? Okay, it's getting a little harder. Some of you might know. I know some of mine. I've never met them, but my mom talked about some of them enough that I could name them. What about great-great-great-grandparents? Okay, does anyone know their great-great-great-grandparents' names? No, okay, that would have been really impressive. But at some point in time, you look back at these people, and you're like, we don't even know their name. Like, I don't know anything about them. They had a direct hand in me being here, but I don't know them. And they lived full lives. I don't know what those lives looked like, but they experienced joy, they experienced grief. They obviously had kids, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And so they had an entire life that I know nothing about. They are forgotten to time. And so as Solomon writes this whole section here, he's facing death. And I don't know what caused him to write this book of the Bible, what inspired it, but I'm picturing Solomon in his old age looking back at life, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe it was because God confronted him and told him that he was going to take the kingdom from him. That'd be pretty sobering to me. If I'm old, I'm facing death, God says that he's mad at me. I'm going to start rethinking some things in my life, hopefully. Perhaps it's because of David's final blessing in his old age, which, if you remember, when David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, and then he said this phrase. He says, I'm about to go the way of all of the earth. It's right there, all of the earth. Everyone dies. It's low. I told you this book was kind of a downer. And Solomon's kind of sobering up to this fact that every person dies, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're wise, whether you're a fool. It is the great equalizer. None of us can escape it. And there's nothing you can do in life that will prevent it or stop it. Gordon joked about having a sauna, maybe getting a couple more weeks, but you can't stop it. You can live a wonderful, powerful, incredible life, or you can live a very mundane and boring and terrible life. Whatever kind of life you live, it all ends the same way. And so Solomon writing here, he's kind of wrestling with this. He's like, why have I been wise? Why have I done all of this if I'm just going to end up in the ground just like this guy who is an idiot? Like, that's what he's saying. He's like, this fool and me, we're going to end up in the same place, yet I've done all these things. Like, why? What was the purpose if we're just going to end up there? And it's kind of scary. It's kind of sobering. This book is very sobering. If you read it, it's meant to be kind of a wake-up call to how you should live your life. And so as we read this next section, starting in verse 18, he's going to continue on with this way of thinking. He says, I hated all my toil or work in which I toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he shall be master for all which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of his heart, for which he toils or works beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. And so Solomon continues this thought of facing death. He's like, well, what's going to happen after I die? What's going to happen with all my stuff? If I died tonight, all of my stuff would inevitably go somewhere else. Things that I've worked really hard on, projects I might be in the middle of, things I've organized or set a specific way. I've devoted lots of time to projects and things that if I died, whoever gets it next, whether it's someone just cleaning out my stuff or someone that's like, oh no, I want that. No matter what, I have no control over what happens with my stuff. Any accomplishments that I've made, they'll be forgotten. Nothing will happen with them. If I built a great building, if I did anything that I'm like, yeah, this will be my legacy, eventually everything fails. Everything is destroyed. And we can look through history and we can see many wonderful things that have
survived for a long time. And you're like, yeah, maybe I will be the person that is remembered. Maybe I'll be like Abraham Lincoln and I'll be remembered. But most likely, we won't be. And that's okay. That is A-okay. We don't have to be remembered. That's not the point of our life. And so Solomon is writing here, and he says that, yet he will be master of all for which I worked and used my wisdom under the sun. And then he continues a little bit lower, and he says, I must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not work for it. When I was in Alaska, before I left, I have this great accomplishment that's actually kind of meaningless. I worked for the state of Alaska, and for a very short period of time, I was the foremost expert on the state of Alaska's travel process. So if anyone working for the state of Alaska had to travel anywhere, I could tell you exactly how that's done and every single step that need to be done. We had a very specific, special built accounting system. Not very many people knew how to use it. I did. I knew all the rules. I knew everything. And I was, for a very short moment, the expert in the entire state. I could even say in the entire world, because no one else uses that accounting system. It was special built. So I was the best at something in the entire world for a very short period of time. And I was proud of it. I'd get calls from important people asking me questions. I'd be like, let me answer that for you. And I built systems, and I knew exactly how everything worked. But as life would have it, that wasn't where my life was meant to be. And I left there, and everything that I had worked so hard for, everything that I knew, I couldn't tell you now. Every process I had invented doesn't really exist anymore. I had spent hours and days and months and weeks of my life. I went in the wrong order there, but that's okay. And now it's meaningless. In the moment, it was great. There was purpose in the work itself, but now I look back and I'm like, yeah, that didn't really mean much. And so Solomon is contemplating the same thing. He's like, who's going to get my stuff? Who's going to take over after me? And if it's not me, if it doesn't work how I designed it, this great trade empire that he created, if it's not going to work how I built it, what's the point of building it? And so he's asking these questions, and he's contemplating death. And only in preparing for death do we really start to question how we should live. And there is a question that I think summarizes the question of the book of Ecclesiastes really well. There's a pastor, his name is David Gibson. I think he's Scottish. If I could do an accent, I would try it now as I read this quote, but I can't. But he asked this question, if we won't live forever, or even long enough to make a lasting difference to the world, how then should we live? I'll read that again. If we won't live forever, or even long enough to make a lasting difference to the world, how then should we live? And this is a question that you can see traced through the entire book of Ecclesiastes. Okay, well, how should I live? If this is meaningless, if there's no point to this, how should I live? And as we finish this morning, we're going to see two answers. The first comes from Solomon at the very end of the book of Ecclesiastes. The final two verses, he answers this question. And it says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Fear God, keep his commandments. That sounds pretty simple. Solomon didn't do that. If he feared God, if he kept his commands, he wouldn't have had so many wives. He wouldn't have created idols. He wouldn't have built altars to idols and worshipped them with his wives. He wouldn't have gone to acquire horses from Egypt. He wouldn't have done all these things if he had feared God and kept his commands. And so Solomon's not a great example, but we do see that he learned something from these mistakes. The second answer actually comes from another king, a wiser, greater king, who is Jesus. Also from the line of David, we have this answer coming from Mark chapter 8. If you would turn there with me, Mark chapter 8. So Jesus gives this answer in Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 34. And calling the crowds to him with his disciples, he said to them, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's will save it. Then he asks this question that feels like it's pulled straight from Ecclesiastes. It says, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? This is like a summary of Solomon's life. He gained the whole world, but he lost himself. He gained the whole world, but he lost what made that world great. It started off worshiping God, and then he fell off. And so when we ask this question, how then should we live? If we look at all these things in this world and we say that, oh, they're meaningless, they lack purpose, we're not going to gain anything. At the end of the day, every single person here, we will pass away. And everything you've done in this life will be forgotten. Anything you've acquired will be gone. So what's the point of living? And Jesus gives this answer here that is wiser and better than Solomon's. He says, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. It's another simple thing. Jesus says that we should deny himself. We should stop putting ourselves first. Life is not about your satisfaction. I'm very sorry to say that. Life is not about you being happy all the time. I wish it was. That would be nice. I'd appreciate that. But life is not solely about you. It's not solely about me. And so I must deny myself, stop putting myself first, take up my cross. I must die to myself, to my ambitions, to my desires. And what I think is interesting about this is Jesus is saying this before he went to the cross. So when we hear this, we hear the very clear picture of Jesus on the cross. And we're like, oh, yeah, there's a little bit of weight to that. But when you read this and it's before, you're like, oh, these people, they don't know that Jesus is doing that. He's talked about the fact that he's going to die, but he hasn't said that he's going to the cross. And yet they knew that this was a custom of the Romans, that the cross was a symbol of death. And so he says, must take up his cross. You must die to yourself. And then he ends it by saying, and follow me. Follow Jesus. And so we have this very clear picture of what life should look like. And if we look back at Solomon's, we have this clear picture of what life could look like, but it shouldn't. And so Solomon lived for himself. If you go back and read chapter 2, he mentions himself, I, me, myself, over 60 times. It's a very short chapter, and yet the entire chapter is still focused on his accomplishments, on his thoughts, on everything to do with him. And yes, it is like his memoir, his epilogue. It makes sense that there'd be some, but 60 is a lot when you consider how small that chapter is. And he says in verse 10 of chapter 2, he says, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. Solomon was the center of the world and the center of his world. People revered and honored him, and he let that go to his head, and he revered and honored himself. And he disobeyed God. And so Solomon, not the best example of this. Even though we acclaim him as wise and doing all these great things, we see that even in his wisdom and his success, he still failed. Instead, we want to follow a better king, King Jesus. And Jesus denied himself for our sake. Before he went to the cross, he asked God if this task could be taken from him. And he so stressed that the Bible says that he sweat blood. I've never been that stressed in my life. And so if we think that Jesus was excited to go to the cross, he's like, yes, I'm going to save everyone today. Like, that's not the picture of Jesus. Instead, Jesus was likely scared, and I can't imagine being in that situation. And so he denied himself for our sake. And even though these people that he's speaking to in the book of Mark, they don't know it yet, but Jesus also took up that cross for our sake. And we have this wonderful blessing of looking back and seeing all these things that people in this time didn't have. We have multiple books of the Bible that weren't written yet, and we should take advantage of that. We should take advantage of the wisdom that we learn here and apply it to our lives. And so our final question is the same question that the book of Ecclesiastes asks, and how should we live, and how do we practically live a meaningful life without falling into the traps of King Solomon? Well, step one, I'm not a trillionaire, so that helps. I don't have all the power that he had. That helps. But Solomon was successful. By any means, any metrics you could come up with, Solomon was successful in this life. There's no one wiser, richer. He was the epitome of success. He was the greatest king in history, and he still, at the end of his life, declared that it was all meaningless. And so Solomon climbed this hilltop of success. He looked back and saw that there was nothing there for him. He had done so much, he had acquired so much, and there was nothing there for him. As we finish, I want to encourage you guys with one final practical thing to kind of take away with this morning. Because we can hear these words and be like, yeah, I'm going to deny myself. I'm going to follow Jesus. And if you've been in the church long enough, if you've thought long enough about it, you're like, I know exactly how to do that. I'm going to leave here, and that's great. But sometimes we hear these words and we're like, yeah, that sounds good. I like that idea. I like the idea of living a meaningful life. But we don't think through the steps, and we walk out of church going, okay, yeah, I learned something, but we don't apply it. We don't do anything with it. And so this morning, there's two ways we can think about how to live life. You can live as if nothing matters, or you can live as if everything matters. And I want you to think about this advice that you've probably heard: don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's pretty common advice. Another way to hear it might be diversify your portfolio. I didn't know what that meant when I was little. I heard it. I knew it was smart. And I was like, I don't know what those are, but I'm going to do that. That sounds smart. But this phrase, don't put all your eggs in one basket. We say it because we don't want to put everything that's valuable to us in one place, because we're afraid of that place losing, that place breaking. If you put all of your hope into your spouse, into a relationship, and that person dies, you're crushed. If you put everything into one spot and you lose it, we're afraid of that. We don't want to lose. And so we put our faith, we put everything scattered around. We put this egg over here, and we find our purpose maybe over there. And so when you look at your life right now and ask, where do you find purpose? What helps you get out of bed in the morning? Is it your job? Do you find purpose in your job? Are you living for the weekend? Where do you find joy in your life? What brings you the most joy, but also where do you value the most joy in your life? If you think about those two things, and then if you think about something maybe future, where do you put your hope? Where do you find the hope in your life? What do you have hope in? There are people that in this upcoming election have so much hope of theirs wrapped up in whoever wins, that whatever happens, if it's not what they want, they're going to be crushed because they put all their hope into that event. And so we ask where we put these things, and I want to encourage you guys, and this is scary, but we should put all of those things in one basket, and that is in the hands of God, in the hands of Jesus. If you look at your life and you think, okay, I have this thing over here that I really care about, this is really important to me, this is really important to me, and they may be good things. Solomon had good things. I'm not saying you can't have good things. But if you take all of these things and you try to put them and keep them in these other places, this is what Solomon's saying. It's meaningless. You're going to lose those things. If you put all your hope in one thing over here and that thing fades away, you're crushed. Your hope is gone. If you put all your purpose in something over here and that fails, if you try to start a business and your whole purpose in life is that business and that business fails, all of a sudden you've lost some of your purpose. And so the Bible encourages us to put everything in Jesus. It says to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Jesus wants all of you. He doesn't want you to fragment out the important things in your life. He wants all of you. And that is scary. If you've ever had someone who's a newborn mom, it's their first child, they don't want other people to really hold their baby because they're like, no, maybe a select few, but they're very protective because they have so much hope and joy wrapped up in that, as they should. It's their baby. But they don't want to give that away. They don't want to lose that. And so this morning, I want you to ask what it would look like for you to take whatever purpose, whatever joy, whatever hope you have in other things, and how do you put them in Jesus? Because Jesus will never fail you. Jesus will never drift away. He'll never leave you. Gordon's been talking about this idea of an upside down kingdom. And this advice of putting your eggs in one basket is upside down. It's not the advice that the world tells us to do, but it is what the Bible calls us to do. It calls us to put our hope in Jesus, put our faith in Jesus, put our purpose in Jesus. So when we read about life without God being meaningless, if you're in this room and you're someone who doesn't know God, I hope that you find yourself in a place where you come to these realizations sooner in life rather than later. Solomon, it took him his whole life, and he had a successful life. You can be the most successful version of yourself and still, at the end of your life, feel like a failure. It's the reason why rich people have just as much suicide rates, because it doesn't satisfy their needs, their longings. Only God does. And this morning, as you leave into the world, I want you to think about where you have those things. Where do you keep them? How do you get them from wherever they are into the hands of God? That might look like giving up something that you really care about, but it might not. If you really love this project you're working on, this person, this business, whatever it is, God doesn't say we have to give them up in a sense that we can't have them, but he says you have to give them to him. You have to give them to him. How can I have this nice thing and still live for God? How do I have this and live for God? And sometimes God does say you must give up what you have. You must leave here and go somewhere else. You must sacrifice these things of your life for me. And that is scary. And we all kind of secretly hope that God doesn't ask those things. Like most people in here probably aren't being like, I wish God would call me to Africa to be a missionary. That's probably not what you're thinking. But if God does, if God lays that on your heart, if God does that, I hope that you would follow. And if you wouldn't, if you're like, no, that's too much, God, like I can't do that, then what are you holding on to that's more important than God? And so I'm going to close with prayer this morning and just the final encouragement that no matter how successful you are, it is meaningless without God. But there's so much meaning in a life with God. And you can have the most boring, mundane life and still have a meaningful, wonderful, good life when you're with God. So let's pray. Father, thank you for your words. Thank you for the life of King Solomon. God, we know that he lived a life that was good and bad, just like all of us. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to learn from the wisdom that he wrote. Lord, help us to face the sobering thoughts that one day we won't be here anymore. And God, if there's anyone in this room who hasn't decided to follow you yet, Lord, I pray that you would put it on their heart this morning, that there is a basket, a place to put everything that they care about in their life that will not fail them, a place to put their hopes, their dreams, their faith, their trust. God, a place to find purpose that doesn't rely on anything of this world that can fail. And Lord, for those that do know you this morning, I pray that you would give them the strength to say, honestly, what have they been focusing on instead of you? What have they been prioritizing instead of you? And how then can they make you the priority of their life? Lord, how can they go from loving the things of this world to loving the person that created those things? Father, we pray all these things in your name.